Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next week in HIM ICD-10 CM coding. First of all, I wanted to share a quick update and highlight what's ahead for next week. First, some good news. I'm going to push out the EHR due date due to all the delays and other issues happening with the bookstore. So there'll be a little bit of extra time to get everything you need. So please don't panic about the EHR Go. You'll see the due date pushed out. You won't have to complete it before you do the quiz this week. So let's take a look at what's coming up for the next few chapters, 7, 8, and 9. Chapter 7 covers all the endocrine, nutritional, and metabolic diseases and immunity disorders. So we'll get into coding things like thyroid disorders, obesity, dehydration, and everything related to diabetes, the diabetic retinopathy, all those different things. An important thing to bear in mind is the focus on using the combination codes to capture the diabetes with the manifestation. We'll also talk about other different types of metabolic and endocrine disorders, nutritional deficiencies, malnutrition, and so on. There's very detailed coding guidelines for this chapter and a lot of instructional notes. Please pay careful attention to those in the tabular. They're essential to make sure that you wind up with the correct code. Chapter 8 gets into mental health, behavioral health, neurodevelopmental disorders. These are all the codes for ADHD, mood and anxiety disorders, depression, everything else. We'll talk about the relationship between ICD-10 CM and DSM-5. We'll talk about the importance of provider documentation, and we'll talk about the importance of reading the documentation and paying attention to whether it's use, abuse, or dependence. And again, like the previous chapter, there's a lot of detailed notes in the tabular that tell you to include code also and everything else, and you need to follow them. And then finally, with chapter 9, we're going to talk about disorders of the nervous system. These are things like cerebral palsy, hemiplegia, headaches, migraines, epilepsy, and everything else in between. So, a couple of tips for success. First of all, review the learning objectives and the key terms. If you don't understand what something says, there's no way you can assign the correct code. Do the video lectures. Some people have not been doing them, and I think it's reflected in their quiz results already. Answer the questions that show up. They'll help you understand the material. And then read the chapter specific and bear in mind the general coding guidelines. And then as you work through these, pay attention to all the references that are mentioned in your book. Your textbook does a nice job of laying out all the chapter specific guidelines for each chapter. So really would be worth your time to pay very close attention to those. I hope you find all this useful. Thank you again for being in the class and persevering with all of the bookstore challenges that we've had. And please feel free to reach out and see me during office hours if you have any questions about any of the material in chapters 7, 8, and 9. That's all I have for you, and we'll see you online. Bye now.